Let's go look at the 1990s then. 1990s, we're building software, and we're building software big. Okay, big was the theme of the 90s. Who was writing software in the 90s? Who was at, I'd say about third quarter of you, fifth of you? Who was at school in the 90s? Most of you. Who was born in the 90s? Hey, fantastic, wonderful. Okay, this is your parents' Agile, right? So large projects, and I'm talking large projects, hundreds of people, multi-year projects. You know, if you were one of the leading edge big companies, you might be planning a release every 18 months to get ahead of the curve. And these are multi-million-dollar investments. Okay, so because they're multi-million-dollar investments, people are very serious about deciding what they're going to invest in, what they're going to pay money for. So what does that mean? You have functional silos, so lots of handoffs. You've got analysts, developers, architects, designers. You've got systems analysts, business analysts, solutions architects, technical architects, lots and lots of specialized roles, and huge amounts of handoffs between those roles. Often those roles weren't even in the same part of the company or the same time zone. Okay, so this was quite big. And you had slow, fragmented technology. Okay, so what I mean by slow, I was working on, this is late 90s, so this is kind of towards the end of the 90s, a reasonably large billing system for a telco. And that was in C++, there's quite a lot of it. And I might change a couple of lines of code and type make, and that was the morning gone. Right, so compiling was reasonably fast, could take anything, 20 minutes or less. But then linking, that's 2 or 3 hours later, right? Big application, and then you deploy that, and then you start running out of memory on HP, Xboxes, and all that. Fragmented technology. So there were many Unixes, right? In our age, Linux is kind of one, right? There were many Unixes. Every major tin manufacturer had a corresponding Unix that was differently broken. Differently weird, okay? So IBM, HP, Sun, which got consumed by Oracle, there was SCO, there were dozens of these things, okay? From two great parents of BSD and System 5, and there were lots of slight incompatibilities. One of the reasons that Richard Stallman wrote GCC, apart from free software, because he's pretty militant about that, was all of the other compilers were rubbish. And so essentially it ended up with that you'd use the Sun compiler was just the bootstrap compiler for GCC. So as long as it could do that, it was fine. And a lot of the technology was proprietary. So you had to, Objective-C, I would argue, is a much nicer object style of C than C++. Why did C++ win? Because Objective-C was a commercial product. You had to pay for it. So we've got slow fragmented technology. And our software development process was modelled on civil engineering. Why is it modelled on civil engineering? Because we like metaphors, right? We're making this stuff up in the 90s. We're still making this stuff up. Who's got a parent in IT? Right, I'm seeing more and more hands each year as I ask this. Today there are 4 hands out of about 300 people. Okay, literally we're making this up. This is not genuine. If this was an architects conference or a healthcare conference, most of us would have a parent who were in it. So we model based on what we already know. So we see engineering and we think that's quite rigorous. And we think that's probably quite a good thing. We should maybe model ourselves on civil engineering. Let's see how that works. So what does civil engineering look like? Civil engineers have learnt that the later in the process you get something wrong, the more expensive it is. If I discover that the elevator shafts are in the wrong place on a drafts board, I just rub it out. Okay? If they're in the wrong place, once I've sunk the pilings, blimey. Someone's going to be upset. Okay? Likewise, if I'm building 2 halves of a bridge and they don't quite meet, that can be a really expensive day. But at least I end up with 2 bridges, which is nice. So, exponential cost of errors. We know this. We've measured this. We've all been burnt by this as civil engineers. Okay. So we're trying to minimise likelihood of errors. Okay. And the way we minimise likelihood of errors is we front load everything. We front load all of the thinking of the spatial stuff onto paper. We front load all of the planning of resources. The cement I'm going to need, the sand I'm going to need, the gravel I'm going to need, aggregates, all of the materials, the steel. I figure out how much of that I want. That is an entire discipline in its own right. It's called quantity surveying. Quantity surveyor comes along and estimates, using charts and things and whatever else, books, exactly the right amount of piles of stuff. A project manager comes and manages the project, because if you're going to have 500 electricians waiting around because 500 bricklayers haven't finished yet, that's a really expensive bit of timing, okay? So the scheduling matters when you're building hospitals. And so we have assurance through formal sign-offs. Is the architecture sufficient? Well, the architect thinks so, but often architecture is vanity architecture. So I'm going to put in a tower or a pillar or a pier or something that's going to look cool. And so what do we get? We get a structural engineer looks at it and says, no. No, you're going to need a supporting thing there, and that's not going to hold its own weight. You go, oh, okay. And so you iterate on that. And so the structural engineer signs off the safety of the building. Why? Because then if part of it collapses, we can go and sue him or her, and we don't get in trouble. Okay? So lots of formal sign-offs. What does that mean? That means any plan we have is very intolerant of slippage. Is this sounding familiar? Is this sounding at all familiar? Okay, so any plan we have is intolerant of slippage, and handoffs then become detailed, become expensive, in a lot of cases become litigious, right? I want double signatures and witnesses and all that kind of stuff. And so this is what we learn. And so as software engineers, we inherit this, so we make a bunch of assumptions. If you assume those first three things, you end up with those two things. In other words, if I assume that I need to front load all of the work and that the work gets exponentially bigger as I go along, then if I make a mistake, guess what? I've got a huge amount of collateral already that I've got to go back and revisit. And so you end up with a reinforcing loop, right? A vicious circle. And so this was the context in which a bunch of middle-aged white men met in a cabin in Utah in 2001. So Bob Martin, Uncle Bob, he's quite cross about some of this other stuff. And it turns out a whole bunch of people are quite cross about some of this stuff. And they have been, during the 90s, quietly getting on with business, quietly delivering systems in big companies in a very different way. They said, well, what if it wasn't like civil engineering? What if it was like a different thing? And so they wanted a name for the different thing. So, and Bob Martin's a very smart guy. He was very deliberate. He said, I'm only going to invite people who have a proven track record of software delivery. This isn't going to be a speculative hand-wavy thing. This is, I want people, and he looks around the industry and he sees Scrum, DSDM, Crystal, FDD, Adaptive, XP, all of these different methods, probably 6, 7 different methods, each of which is independently racked up a bunch of successes. He looks across his peer group and he sees people like the pragmatic programmers, Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas, and he gets all these people in a room and he says, we've got an awful lot of stuff in common. What we need is a name. We need a name for this thing. So we want to come up with a word, a brand that's going to represent what we value. And they came up with a word. Oh no, sorry. That's not the word they came up with. That's just a really bad reference to Heathers. So I don't know if any of you guys seen the 80s movies Heathers, but there's this wonderful moment in it where there's a word that... Anyway, moving on. That's not the word. This is the word. They went with Agile. They said, we will describe the thing... And in fact, Agile wasn't their first choice. Their first choice was the word adaptive. We want something that adapts to new information. Unfortunately, one of the guys in the room, Jim Highsmith, already had a successful method, software delivery method, called adaptive software engineering, which was based on RAD. And funny enough, he didn't put his foot down and say, you can't call it adaptive. The other guys in the room said, that would be unfair. We don't want to hijack your brand. We'll go with a different word. So Agile was second choice. So the main output of the Snowbird Summit, as it's known, in 2001, was a thing called the Agile Manifesto. Now, I think you can probably guess what I'm going to say next. The things I'm going to talk about next. What am I going to talk about next? Agile values. No. No, I'm not. And here's why I'm not, eventually. Here's why I'm not, is people tend not to look past the fold. So you look at the Agile Manifesto and it's a lovely picture and it's got these guys all standing around a board and it's all nicely pixelated. And then you have, people over process and blah, blah, blah. And then you look beyond the fold, because those things are value statements. In fact, they're examples of value statements. It's really hard to go and enact value statements, okay? So especially if you're learning a new thing. So if someone says, a tennis coach says, okay, so what you need to do is focus on your foot position and keep your balance slightly centre and slightly forward and lean into the ball. You're like, what? How do I hold the stick thing? Yeah? And so when you get a bunch of value statements, it's really hard to work with those. So it turns out when you turn the page, there's also a bunch of what they call principles. And there's a dozen of these principles. I want to very quickly go through some of these things. So you've got the idea of early and continuous delivery of software. That's one of them. You want to welcome changing requirements. Okay? These are things I can do. I can have a changing requirement and I can welcome it, or I can push it away. Okay? That's a behaviour I can adopt. What else can I do? I can deliver frequently. Okay, that's the thing I could do. I could try and deliver frequently as opposed to not frequently. So each of these things is comparative. I could do this versus not doing this. And some of these things are so obvious. And it kind of sets the scene about how bad the industry was that someone had to call these things out. Okay, and in fact, a group of people at the front of their discipline had to call these things out. There's some more things. There's working software as a measure of progress. Have you shipped yet? Is it working? Can I use it? Right, we'll call that progress. Self-organizing teams. Self-organizing teams means you bring all the different disciplines together rather than having very rigorous, rigid handoffs. What else have we got? Technical excellence. Oh, technical excellence. That'd be nice, right? Why do you need to call out technical excellence in software engineering? I don't know. I do know. I was there. I was writing some of that stuff. And they say things like we want business people and developers working together. We want the idea of building projects around individuals, around people who really care about that thing, rather than, we've got these people, let's just throw work at them, all right, and shout at them until they do the work. We want to value face-to-face communication. That's a big deal. Simplicity. All I'll say about simplicity is simplicity. It turns out you can spend days talking about simplicity. It's a very, very deep and complex topic. But simplicity is a thing we value, right? Sustainable pace. Okay, pulling this off once is easy. You just burn a bunch of people out. Okay, doing this sustainably again and again. And I love, because this is a room full of programmers. Don't forget, they said not just sustainable for us. Sustainable for business people, users, everyone else, okay? So it's not enough for us to be sustainable if we're burning everyone else out on the way through. And finally, they said we need to reflect and tune on a regular basis, okay? So that seems like quite a sensible bunch of things to want to do. And this, don't forget, this is in the 90s, okay? So then we've got this brand. We've got this idea of a brand. So what's a brand then? A brand in technical language, a brand is, or to brand something, is to give a product a distinctive identity, okay? So what that means in linguistics terms is, I think there's a field of linguistics called semiotics. Semiotics is the association of meaning to symbols. What that means in this context is this: a brand, it doesn't matter what the word is, it matters what your association with the word is. What does the symbol of that word cause you to feel? Okay, so if you hear, product brands. Okay, there are product brands that make you feel safe. Right, Waitrose, John Lewis, we think of those as trustworthy brands. Okay, Lidl, Asda, we think of those as maybe sort of towards the less expensive end of supermarket kind of brands. Right, so there's an association with brand. And there was a brand that came out of this whole period that kind of won. Okay, and it's a brand called Scrum. So the brand of Agile kind of won. The brand of Agile stuck, it's just that it wasn't Agile, it was Scrum. Or rather, the two words have kind of become synonymous. Because Scrum kind of represents, well actually it doesn't represent these things at all. It represents these things. Okay, so it represents some of the things. Okay, technical excellence kind of fell through the cracks a bit, or at least Scrum doesn't have an opinion about it. Simplicity, again, Scrum doesn't have an opinion about that. It does, however, have an opinion about face-to-face communication, usually in the form of, do you have the estimates? Are you committed to them? Let me beat you up. Okay? Where's my stuff? Delivering through. I'm riding Scrum hard here, aren't I? Scrum changed our industry. Okay? 15, 20 years ago, people were delivering in years and thinking that was normal. Scrum caused people to be able to deliver in months. Okay? Now, that's kind of my point, is that was true in the 90s. Let's take a look at Scrum now. This is a small screen grab from an article on InfoQ yesterday. Okay? InfoQ, pretty well regarded, kind of leading edge technology site. They have an article there about Capital One. So there we go, a big bank using agile methods. And what do they say? They say, we've trained 3,000 people in the agile methodology. Right? No, they haven't. Because that isn't a thing. There isn't one. There's several of them. But what we've done is we conflate the word agile with Scrum and we say we're using the agile methodology. And that's kind of normal now. Okay? So things like, so when you talk about, we don't talk about customer anymore, it's always product owner. Okay, and product owner is actually a proxy into the business. It's very rarely an actual business stakeholder. It's usually someone who used to be a project manager and didn't quite get all that Scrum Master nonsense and wants to be able to shout at people still. Okay, and they really don't want to let go of that, so we call them a product owner. Okay, and sometimes they have domain knowledge and sometimes they don't, and them's the breaks. So in the 2010s then, so in our decade now, well, we've got smaller projects. That's pretty cool. We've got significantly smaller projects now. We batch money in smaller lumps. And because people like the message of Agile, they like the idea of better, faster, cheaper, and all this kind of stuff. We tend to have cross-functional feature teams now. I hear this term feature teams a lot, either Scrum teams or feature teams. So there is this idea now that there is a generic grouping of human beings, which is a formula of N developers plus M testers, where M is strictly less than N, plus 1 or / a fraction of a BA, plus Scrum Master product owner equals delivery unit. Okay, and that's the unit of delivery, and that's software solved. Okay, we're done. We can all go home now. So we have these cross-functional feature teams, and what else do we have? We've got faster technology, we've got commodity technology. Okay, so I don't need to think about which variant of Unix I'm using now. Okay, an awful lot of the stuff I have is open source. I have a small, manageable process, okay, that doesn't take reams and reams and shelves of documents to define my process. So we're either doing Scrum, who's doing Scrum, or some variant of Scrum? Okay, okay. Who's doing Kanban or some variant of Kanban? Okay. Keep your hands up, keep your hands up. Keep your hands up if you're limiting work in process, measuring cumulative flow, using that to make predictions about SLAs. No, you're not doing Kanban, right? What you're doing is Scrum without any of the Scrum. Yeah? You got fed up with Scrum, so you threw out all the governance, and now you call that a process. You're doing unmanaged delivery. Awesome, right? Go read up on Kanban, it's quite useful. But we've got a process that's modelled now on iterative delivery. We're trying to ship things iteratively. So, and all this sounds pretty good. Except, right, there's an elephant in the room here, except we're still batching the money. So we still have programs and program definitions and annual budget cycles. And even though I've got my Scrum teams, and I might have several Scrum teams, I'm planning millions, typically, of pounds of spend across a bunch of people for a period of time. Okay, so the money is batched in. That conversation, all those conversations, and often a laundry list of what I'm going to get for that money, that will happen well outside, well before delivery. Downstream, we've got batching of infrastructure. Okay, I have 2 large organisations I've been working with in the last 12 months. Both of whom essentially would love to, on the delivery function, own their own infrastructure, and they don't. And each of them spends inordinate amounts of mental anguish and actual physical time, and more meetings than any human being should be subjected to try and get stuff into production. Okay, so there's this Scrum in the middle, and then just for Adrian, we have water, Scrum, fall. Okay, so the idea is that you have waterfall either side of Scrum. I've got batching, a bit of spinny roundy stuff, batching. Okay, and the problem with that model is nothing moves faster because the lead time is from there to there. And if there's a bunch of time there and handoffs and a bunch of time there and handoffs, people could care less what we're doing there. Okay, we care because it means it's a nicer way to work. So then, where next? Whither Agile? So it's a cloud and it's a question mark. Do you like what I did there? It's a cloud and it's a question mark. You're welcome. So this whole thing about cross-functional feature teams, where did that come from? Someone said there should be cross-functional feature teams rather than people working in functional silos. There's a lean principle. So one of the core ideas in lean operations is that you move the people to the work. And it doesn't sound that revolutionary until you realize that in almost every industry, particularly manufacturing industries, you move the work to the people. You have people at workstations, wherever they are, and you take the work item and I do some stuff to it, and then it gets moved over here, and then you do some stuff to it, and it gets moved along, and the work moves around. So this lovely chap, Taiichi Ono, in the 1950s said, that's bonkers. There's no value being added to the work when you transport it. He actually identified a whole bunch of things where there's no value being added to them when you do things. So there's no value being added when you yourself walk around. If I take this bottle over here and put it down here, and I go and get this lid, put the lid over here, right? No value was added during that movement. Okay? If I produce too much of a thing, more than anyone wants, I've just produced too much of a thing. There's no value added there. So transporting work around is a non-value adding activity. And with knowledge work, that's actually transporting development stuff around. So how do you counter that? You bring all the people to one place. Okay, that makes sense. So then you get cross-functional teams. However, when you pan back and start doing larger programs of work, you've kind of got the same problem again. Because now I've predefined my set of Scrum teams or feature teams and they're doing what they do, and I've got this big program of work, I need to figure out how to slice up the work and funnel it into all of those feature teams. So I need to do the kind of the divide piece there and then the join piece at the back. And anyone who's written any kind of fork join, scheduling, semaphore, I'm looking at you, Farley, right? This is insanely difficult, okay? And you're always moving at the speed of the slowest piece. And so you end up with that problem. And so what we want to do, we want to move the people to the work. In other words, what we want is a much more fluid organisation. So now you start thinking at team scale is the group of people to solve the problem. If the problem I have is a big, wide problem, I'm going to need a big, wide group of people. That's my team. My 50, 60, 70, 100 people pointing at a problem, that's my definition of team. I now figure out, or ideally they figure out, what's the best way for those guys to divide themselves up such as they can face off to the work coming down the pipe. Since the work coming down the pipe is going to change as a function of time, the org structure, the team structure, is likely to change as a function of time. Given that the types of work I'm engaging in are going to be different types of work, it's likely that different groups of people are going to be best suited to tackle that work. And so now you start to define the groupings of people as a function of the pull on the system, okay, the types of work that we're trying to do in order to move the business forward, and suddenly it's a less trivial problem than M plus N plus a tester. Okay? It's a little bit more sophisticated than that. But remember, they are actual human beings here. Okay? So it's not just put them in a bag and shake them up. These people have aspirations and careers and families and hopes and that kind of stuff. Okay? So let's be sensitive to that. So we want more than no process. I'm looking at you, Kanban. Right? We want more than no process, but we don't want rigid process. Okay? So we've swung the pendulum both ways now. Okay? RAD in the early 90s was, look, we're done with all this nonsense. And then the kind of heavyweight, if you like, Scrum stuff that we're doing now is kind of the pendulum the other way. Somewhere in the middle is a sane grouping of things we could do. So now what does a team start to look like at scale? Okay, let's go solve for that. That's a much more interesting thing. So what do? Now we can start measuring business impact. All of the software metrics we have, all the metrics we have from things like Scrum, even XP, all these things, they measure software productivity. Okay? How do we measure software productivity? We measure it in terms of velocity. Okay? So feature, story points, stories, there's a measure of units, okay? And then we take this team scale measure of velocity and we say, hey, this is how fast we're going. It's not how fast we're going, it's how much distance we're covering. That tells me nothing about whether I'm moving towards my goal, how soon I'll be at my goal, or whether the distance I'm travelling is even in a sensible direction. It doesn't tell me any of that, it just tells me I'll deliver this many features. Okay? And why do we do that? Oh, Dan, you're beating up on these things. These people must have been idiots. They weren't. They were using the best information they had. They were using proxy metrics. We can now move fast enough that we have real metrics. Okay? I can measure business impact because I can ship something small fast enough that I can immediately measure whether it matters. And if it matters, I keep it, and if it doesn't matter, I kill it. And in fact, it's so inexpensive, I can do several of them at once. Okay? And the ones that win pay for the ones that don't. And it turns out if you're a venture funding person, that's basically your day job. Your day job is let's find a bunch of people who might win, and the ones that win pay for the ones that didn't. And everyone has a great time. So software productivity isn't a thing, okay? Velocity isn't a thing. So in terms of software then, less is more, right? Less is more like surgery. I don't want your stinking software. I don't want your stinking features. What I want is some business capability, okay? As a trader, I would like to be able to trade with my mind. Okay? I would like to be able to trade at the speed I can reason about a market rather than having to click around on a bunch of stuff. Okay? That's irritating. Right? As a shopper, I would like to now be wearing the new outfit. That's what I want. My goal is to be wearing the new... In fact, my goal is for my friends to say, that's a really nice new outfit you've got, Dan. Okay? So what's the lead time to that? Well, clicking around on a stupid website isn't helping me. Yeah? So I don't want software, I want fewer features, I want opinionated things, and I want them to be tiny. So now, this is going to get me in trouble with Adrian. I'm going to assume technology is instant and free. Okay? You'll notice the asterisk there. At least compared to the 90s. Right? It is now instant and free. What do I mean? What I mean is I used to have a 6-month lead time to get a server. I can now spin up 1,000 servers in a second. Okay? Or even better, I can have 1,000 servers sitting up there and I can deploy containers into them in literally milliseconds. This is bonkers. This is bonkers fast. So technology is instant and free. It's free and instant to write. My programming languages are no longer proprietary. As someone who used to code C++ for money, right, the fact that I can type into my IDE Java code and have it compiling behind my fingers as I type is magic. It's still magic, right? Go has a slightly faster compiler than I can hit enter. Okay? These things are, so writing code is now at the speed that I can think and manipulate code. It's not at the whim of some tooling. Build, again, build is near instant. If that's scaring you, use Scala, okay? And then it'll build much slower. If that's scaring you, then use Maven to build Scala, and then you're back in C++. It's all fine. Okay, so if it's going too fast, those are the brakes. Okay, I'm only saying that because Dean Wampler's downstairs teaching a Scala class. So build, provisioning. Provisioning is free, instant. Okay, it's cents per day. Right, it costs me a few US cents a day to run a server. It's bonkers. I can have thousands of servers, and I can put that on. It costs me about the price of a coffee. Okay. Deploy, again, is free, is instant. All of that stuff exists. That infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. And then monitor is free and massively at scale because Adrian. Okay? Because Adrian built me a massive monitoring and alerting capability that, as a side effect, streams video. He says, stealing his line. Yeah. So now I want to embrace continuous delivery. What does that mean? 2 weeks is an illusion, 2 months doubly so. So Douglas Adams reference there, if anyone recognises it. Right, having a planning horizon of 2 weeks is nuts if I can try 5 product ideas in a morning. Okay, it's both too short and too long. I should be having an opinion 2 or 3 months out. I should be having an opinion 2 or 3 hours out. Anything in between is random. Outcomes create options. So I've got an emergent system here. So it's not about changing requirements, it's discovery of requirements through delivery. It's a complex adaptive system. I've now got a rolling OPEX versus an upfront CAPEX. I don't need to think about dumping a bunch of money in. I can just rent my service as I go, and when I'm not getting value anymore, I switch it off, or I dial it down. And then finally, I've got investment. Look, collaboration over commitment is still there. But now we're having collaborative conversations about investment. Should we invest in this thing, rather than give me an estimate, I'll hold you to it. Would you use a 1990s computer now to do stuff other than for retro? Right? No. And why would you use a 1990s methodology? Okay, so here's our manifesto again, right? I think they made a pretty good go at that. It's emerging requirements is what I change. Business impact is what I change. Business developers and everyone else build products around motivation. Continuous reflection. Deliver continuously. That wasn't bad for a first draft. Right? 15 years later, the vast majority of that is still relevant. We just need to adapt it differently to where we're at. Thank you.